Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our second clergy conversation on acknowledging and confronting our history and facing our future, a covenant of anti-racism. I'm Chris Faison, and I'll be facilitating our conversation again today. And we will be moving on to a second period on Reconstruction through pre-World War I. So I'll go on and share my screen with you all. Okay. So again, we started on the town's founding through the Civil War, and so today we'll pick up at Reconstruction and go through pre-World War I. And let's see. So the key term for this week, we looked at individual racism last week. So for this week, it's interpersonal racism, and it's defined as occurring between individuals. These are public expressions of racism that often involve slurs, biases, or hateful words or actions. So that's the term that we'll think about a little bit as we're looking at our history for this time period. Okay, so for the first question, I wanted to pose to you all, and I'll pose the question, then I'll give you some background information, and we'll come back to the questions after we go through the little bit of information. So the first is that the new North Carolina Republicans in 1867 were the first to remake Chapel Hill as a, quote, people's university, no longer reserved, quote, for the few. For years, administrations of UNC Chapel Hill have represented itself as the people's university. What's your response as a clergy person, and how would your communities of faith respond? So in this first question, again, the new North Carolina Republicans in 1867 were the first to, they included the formerly enslaved plus 1/5 of the white electorate, which was the largest of white voters in any southern states across the color line. And there's a quote that I think best summarizes this time period that talks about how the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. And that's by Brian Stevenson, the head of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And I think that really encapsulates this period really well. The 1868 new Constitution for North Carolina changed the university as well, and it stripped the legislator's authority to appoint the university's trustees, and it gave it to the State Board of Education, which was controlled by the governor, which should sound familiar for the past few years with struggles over who gets to be on boards and make decisions. So to remake as a people's university and no longer reserved for the few was this new shift for the few years after the conflict, and the new UNC president, Solomon Poole, he was against the university being run by the aristocracy and family influence. He thought better to close it than to leave it in the hands of ex-Confederates, and saw the campus and the town as a, quote, nursery of treason. So one of his faculty members that caused a lot of controversy, Fisk Brewer, he was a Greek professor. And at the end of the war, he came south to be a principal of a freedmen's school. And of course, that was from the Freedmen's Bureau that helped the formerly enslaved get transitioned into their new station. And he shocked local whites by inviting blacks to dine at his home. Cornelia Phillips Spencer, who was one of the leading attackers of Poole's administration and his faculty, she had a steady barrage of letters to Democratic papers condemning this new way of life. And also, it should be noted that men of wealth were angered who had invested their fortunes in the Confederate war effort and now saw that wealth disappear. So that's a little bit about that first, some background on that first question. So the next question we'll look at. Many white voters in the central Piedmont defected to the Republican cause, which placed Chapel Hill near the center of the violent insurgency to unseat North Carolina's interracial Republican government. Despite the discussion of Chapel Hill as a, quote, motley collection of ex-Negro teachers and scallywags, it was redeemed as early as 1871. What would you infer from this? And so for this time period, again, Chapel Hill happened to be near the center of the violent insurgency that determined to unseat by force of arms and intimidation North Carolina's biracial Republican government. And I use that, that's actually a quote. Biracial, of course, we know now as an identifier, but that was the way that people tended to refer to that government back in that time period. This insurgency was led by the Klan. The Central Piedmont, of course, included, again, many white voters who defected to the Republican cause. And by late 1869, the Klansmen were riding openly through Chapel Hill. The next year, Governor Holden tries to counterattack. He requested federal help, but President Grant refused because he was wary of the unyielding turmoil in the South. In the next year, in February of 1871, with no funds and few students, the university trustees suspend classes and close its doors. And then the next month, they basically got ahead of seeing the writing on the wall with Holden being removed based on this idea of redemption. And this was the first successful impeachment of a governor in the history of the U.S. That's something that is interesting. We have this great fusion government of people with different backgrounds, but we also impeach our governor for the first time in the country's history. And then this redemption, quote, was considered being redeemed from the unwise doctrine of universal equality. And as Poole's memory is erased, so was the idea that the era might have ended any other way. So that's a little bit of background for that piece. And then the last question that we'll look at, the nadir or low point of American race relations ranged from the end of Reconstruction through the early 20th century. Compare and contrast the public expressions of hateful actions during the 1919 Red Summer and 2020 Red Spring that is ongoing. And I'll come back and define those for us. So at this period, Democratic leaders organized in the state a massive propaganda campaign emphasizing the dangers of, quote, Negro rule. The 1898 Wilmington Massacre or insurrection, which is becoming more known now, was a political coup d'etat that was unprecedented in American history. So again, we had first governor that's impeached, and now we have the first takeover of a local city government because of not liking the current leadership. William Rand Keenan Sr., an 1864 UNC graduate, was the commander of a white supremacist paramilitary force, which massacred scores of Blacks. That came out over the past couple of years over the Silent Sam struggle. And then one thing that a lot of people are just starting to understand is that 10 years later, his sister-in-law, Annie Hill Keenan, the then head of the United Daughters of the Confederacy of North Carolina Division, she posed an idea of a Confederate monument to Francis Venable, the UNC president. Venable visited Wilmington on Keenan's invite on October 15th of 1909 on the monument project in Chapel Hill. Venable found Silent Sam's inspiration through his admiration of a Wilmington Confederate monument built years before. And I wanted to lift up the name Charlene Register, a local Chapel Hill citizen who's a faculty member in the African American and Diaspora Studies department. She taught me as an undergrad about the devastating impact of the film Birth of a Nation in 1915, and it's linked to the first Red Scare, as well as the closing of the nadir of American race relations, which again is the low point between the end of Reconstruction and the early 20th century. And the Red Summer of 1919 really helps to give a bookend to that period that also coincides with the 1918 to 1919 flu pandemic. So 100 years ago, when we had our last pandemic, we had lots of racial upheaval as well. The Red Summer was basically from late winter through early autumn of 1919, where white supremacist terrorism and racial riots in more than 36 cities swept across the US. And a faculty member, Robert Green II, a history assistant professor at Claflin University in South Carolina, he is terming our current time as a Red Spring. So that's some background for that question. And so what I'll do is head back to the initial key terms for us to consider, again, interpersonal racism. This definition, again, it occurs between individuals, and these are public expressions of racism, often involving slurs, biases, or hateful words or actions. So I wanted to give people time to react to and think about this working definition, especially as it relates to, or it builds on our individual racism quote from last week.
Well, I'm thinking about two things in terms of their interrelation. It's individual racism in action or in relationship, right? And then I'm also thinking about cultural norms that have to permit it in order for that expression to happen. There have to be cultural norms that make it permissible.
I also think that this is what people often think of when they think of racism, but particularly before the recent years of trying to teach us white folks more deeply about systemic racism and other kinds of racism. But I think for white people who say, I'm not a racist, it usually translates into, I don't say stuff like that. And so if I don't say stuff like that, then I'm not a racist.
Would it be fair to say that this might also be essentially the same thing as explicit bias versus implicit bias, Chris?
That's a good way to say it. I'd like to punt it to other people as well. Do people have opinions about that? I think that's a good way to frame it. And also, I wanted to say that last week a lot of you all were already kind of mentioning this. I like how all of this is interrelated, and we'll keep spiraling around the different definitions of racism and then anti-racism later. But other people have thoughts about explicit as opposed to implicit.
I agree. Absolutely, I agree. And we see it in various forms. But one thing I'd say is that the explicit is sometimes goes unacknowledged by the person who is explicitly doing it. So I mean, microaggressions, for instance, are for the person who's committing them, they often aren't aware or aren't as aware as they ought be of the aggression.
Are there other thoughts about this work?
Yeah, I was thinking about explicit racism, not just using terms and slurs, but also how you frame conversation around an issue and the platform you use. So, like our church, you all heard the story about the black NASCAR driver who they found a noose in his garage, and then discovered later that it was something that had been hung several months ago before everything changed. But there was reaction on his part and others, and the story kind of took on a life of its own. Well, some of our members did sort of a victory lap when it was discovered that the rope was hung several months ago. Like can't we not jump to assuming the worst about people without any sensitivity to the dangers he has to navigate all the time. So forgive him for being a little bit quick to respond when he's trying to thrive. He's trying to break some boundaries. He's in a very white sport. I never in my lifetime thought I would see in NASCAR the banning of the Confederate flag. So then at our church, white folks that are kind of oblivious to privilege will say, see, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't meant to be a noose. And we have Black people and people of color in our church, and they don't talk about this directly. Instead, they see the Facebook post and they see the people who like it and they see the people who comment on it and say, yeah, see, it's a bunch of hullabaloo over nothing. And then at some point in the future, they're all back in church together. And what's that interaction like? And I've recently discovered that someone who's Black, who's been in our church for 5-6 years, has been wearing a mask, you know, a metaphorical mask, trying to be black, fitting into a white space. And she and I have talked about it a lot, but I didn't realize there were layers that she wasn't going to, that she didn't feel safe with me. And the George Floyd thing kind of made her say, well, I'm just going to lay it all out for you now, Rob. And I don't know if we'll see her back. And I hope we do. I mean, she's not just been a member of our church, she's been a leader in our church. And I hope we see her back. But she finally feels the freedom to say our church, which has a lot of different racial backgrounds represented in it, is an unsafe white space. And I think it's because of how these conversations are framed and the platform that's used, Facebook, where you don't have to be filtered and you don't have to say anything explicitly racist to create a very unsafe environment for a completely free conversation.
I think, you know, just with the difference between explicit and implicit, you know, one of the things I say this all the time, and I say it proud. I'm a native of Chapel Hill, born and bred. All of my family live in Chapel Hill. I think one of the things is that, you know, you don't have to have all the answers. And I think you can show support without trying to state facts. You know, one of the things that was just kind of bothersome to me is people I've known probably over 30, 35 years. You know, some things they just put on social media, and they were not explicit things, but they were implicit because these are the facts why this is this and this is this is this. And I'm kind of like, yeah, you don't have to do that, because then you're kind of minimalizing what's going on by doing that. And I don't think as a person who is not Black or of color, like, I don't think it's your due diligence to have all the answers and state the facts and say this is this, because then it looks like, and this is what I do with, or even with the Bible. I mean, I know the Bible says that we should speak the truth in love, and we should walk in love, and I get it. And so one of the things I tell my people, well, if somebody beats somebody, does that person deserve love? They do. Do they deserve forgiveness? They do. But we're going to use the law, and then we're going to love them after. And what happens a lot of times is like, oh, these people deserve love. We get it. Get it. We're clergy, we're preachers, we're pastors. But the deal in hand is this person broke the law. So let's implement the law, and then we can implement what the word says. You know, I have people in my church that have been in jail, done time in prison, but nobody said, you know what, they did whatever. Let's implement the word, the Bible, and then just kind of let them go. They had to serve their time. And so I think, you know, just trying to have the answers, you know, because I am from Chapel Hill, which is this great big melting pot. Like, I've known Matt basically all my life. Like, I just don't feel like white people have to have the answers, especially if you have a relationship with them previously. Like, I just don't think that's the start of a conversation. And so, but when there's facts, because they are trying to be a conversation, it's almost like an implicit thing to me. You know, I had a guy I've known forever, was one of the managers, and Matt's gonna know who I'm talking about now. I should have started out like that. But he works with African American boys. He's a coach. He's a teacher. He was a manager on the team with Dean Smith. and he's got a black guy as his Facebook picture, but he put 75% of fathers not in the home. That's y'all's problem. And I'm like, whoa. Like, I've known this guy for 35 years. Like, he didn't call me a racist name. But he basically said, hey, what happened with George Floyd? That ain't y'all's problem. What happened with, the problem is Black kids don't have fathers in homes. And I just thought that was a very insensitive thing to say. And then he followed by some more things. So even though he wasn't saying something, he was saying something. And then I was just kind of like, this guy works with Black kids. So I think by always having the answers, always having facts is an input. If somebody loses their mom goes on to be with the Lord. The thing as a pastor, I don't call them and say, hey, I understand what you're going through, because I don't. I talked to my mom this morning. So my thing is, hey, what you're dealing with right now, it probably sucks. It's probably crappy. And then I'm not going to give them scripture, oh, to be absent from the body is to be present from the Lord. Death, where's your sting? Yeah, I don't really want to hear that right now. I lost my mom, and it hurts. It sucks. So what I don't do is I don't implement the word to put on a reaction that or emotion that a natural person has. I mean, that's what we're supposed to say as clergy. She's in no more pain. Great. I get it, but I miss my mom. Can I not miss my mom? Can I not cry? Can I not be upset with God for a little bit? God's not going to not talk to me anymore because I'm upset with him. But I'm just like, hey, if you need to talk, I'm here. I'm going to call and check on you every day. That's because I don't understand. And so that's my rant. I went on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think there's a nature to, when we talk about having all the answers, is this that kind of like the danger of being a know-it-all, you know? I mean, I think as ministers and congregations, we're expected to have a lot of answers and talk a lot, and use a lot of words, but perhaps where we are in our pastoral ministry, specifically with this important issue, is to do less talking and more listening, and to take that posture of saying, I don't know it all, and that's okay. I don't have to have all the answers. I'm going to do more listening and learning than I am to try to stand on my soapbox and pontificate on whatever issue I think I need to be an expert on, to hide behind my own insecurities of not knowing. So I think you're absolutely right. That pastoral approach of listening and not giving a cliche answer or cliche Facebook post is super important in this time.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate what y'all shared so far. There's a lot of good stuff in that, and I think that it's just I'm hopeful that it'd be interesting to see, like, as this is shared, you know, with you all's different communities, like for us to think about ways to. I know the last session will be a kind of a come together, but it definitely sounds like there'll be lots of opportunity to continue to help each other with these, you know, the facts, and then the venue, like you all are saying, like there's just a lot of ways that we can help to create, I think, cause less harm and create more understanding, like we're doing right now. Yeah, were there any other, I don't want to cut it short if anyone else has more ideas about, you know, these concepts of racism, and particularly around, you know, slurs, biases, hateful words or actions.
I mean, I think I would love, you know, when I just saw the slide that was up earlier, I didn't even know where the People's University came from. But I know that's one thing, as being a native of Chapel Hill, like we always hung our hat on. Like I can hear Charles Carrault right now saying the University of the People, and going to school with his grandson, Kit Carrault. And it was the University of the People because it's like the university and the university belonged to the town, and the university belonged to the people, and the Tar Heels belonged to the people. And it was just kind of like, this is our town. This is our university. This is the people's university because it belongs to everybody. And I just think growing up in Chapel Hill, that's what I was. I went to probably more bar mitzvahs in my life than just know anybody, you know, Josh Clapper and Rachel Lipper and you know, we have a Jewish lady that goes to our church, and I tell you what, she has made me be more inclusive than I've ever been in my life because she doesn't understand anything. And I don't understand anything that she understands. And so when I taught Pentecost, I had to go back and study like I never did before because I wanted her to understand. Because it just wasn't to say, hey, we got a white person who goes to our church. We have a Jewish lady who goes to our church. But it's to make sure, like, hey, you belong here. Like, you're not just going to have to adapt what we're doing here in our Black church, but we want you to know you belong. So I got to figure you out. I got to be able to teach from where you are. I got to be able to make sure the words are on the screen because every Black person in here knows who Tasha Cobbs is. Rachel Fine doesn't know who Tasha Cobbs is. And so, you know, that I thought that was interesting. I never knew where that term came from. I just thought it was like, hey, the university is ours because we live here and we're Tar Heels, and there's the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, and then there's Dean Smith, and then there's Bill Guthridge. You know, so.
Yeah, I guess what I'm taking out of this too, as I'm hearing, is like really the importance when we're having these conversations in our congregations and communities is the importance of defining terms. Like we come to the table, this kind of assumptions that they understand all the terms that we're talking about, that there needs to be some significant work in all getting on the same page and understanding what terms that we're using. We come, whether it's terms like racism or implicit, explicit bias, or even what bias means. And really getting and doing the hard work of trying to get on the same page of defining these terms together. We've done some work in faith and science discussions, and the same way goes. If you're going to say I believe in God, then we need to get on the same page on what we understand what that word even means, or faith or scripture. There's work that has to be done even on that level, but on this level is a whole nother I guess, level of work that we need to do in terms of doing the hard work of defining the terms together to come up on and be on the same page.
I want to pose a question to the group based on the story Nate told about his friend that is white and coaches Black kids, and because I think this gets to the unifying, and also a little bit to what Will was saying about terms. When Nate told the story, he said the guy mentioned a quote about percentages of homes without fathers and said, y'all's problem is. And I just wonder if there's a way we, in whatever church we are in, or whatever our racial background is, can reframe that to our problem. Because we all suffer from racism. We're all hurt by it. And I think that if we create a you and us mentality, or if we submit to a you and us mentality that already exists, there's a divide that has to be bridged before we can have conversations with laypersons. I mean, I don't think that in this clergy group, but with laypersons, I don't know if there's group wisdom that says how do we communicate to our churches that, okay, hey, I'm white and I have every conceivable privilege, but a context of racism is my problem, and I'm wounded by that. And we might all suffer different wounds, but we have to get away from, this is y'all's problem. This is our problem. How do we do that?
And the thing about the guy who made the statement, I honestly do not believe, no one can make me think that this guy is a racist. I really don't think he is. He's been consistent. I've known him since I was 10. I really don't think he's a racist. I just think that You don't always have to have the answers. Like I've talked about what's going on in our culture one time from our pulpit. And I told them this is the one time I'm going to talk about it, and that's going to be it. I'm not going to get up here and talk about racism every week. I'm a preacher. I'm a pastor. I'm going to talk about what the word says. I'm not going to change my Facebook post every week. I'm not going to change my thing to Black Lives Matter every week. I'm just not going to do it. Because I'm not going to come out of my character of who I am. It's not really who I am. There are professionals who do that. But it's just not who it's not what I do. If I talk to Matt, I want to talk about basketball. If I want to talk to Rob, talk about his kids and his wife serving in Ridge. But I really don't think this person's a racist. I absolutely do not. I do not think he could be consistent for 30 plus years. And I can take the tag and put racist on him because of one statement he made, I feel probably with good intentions. He thinks Governor Cooper is the craziest person in the world too, because he don't want to wear masks and he's going to find a thing or why you shouldn't. That's just him, period. And I think sometimes you have to just take people as that's just them, but not put racist on him.
I think it's helpful to distinguish like the person from the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And, while we may not want to call that person a racist person, his comment suggests, I think, a racist idea, because it insinuates that the problem of absentee fathers in Black homes is a failure of personal responsibility, or it assumes the worst about a whole group or race of people. But where are those Black fathers? They're in prison, and so it's not attentive to the social and structural forces that are oppressive to people of color in our country. So I think what's racist about that comment is what it assumes about Black people, and I do think that is a problem that we all share. It's our collective responsibility to care for our communities in such a way that don't criminalize entire groups of people. So I think that there was a lot to learn from that exchange, and I really appreciated that story. And I'm really sorry, for what he said to you. And I think that you're very gracious in relating to him and trying to understand where he's coming from, Nate. And I think it's important, especially as white people in this conversation, that we acknowledge, yeah, there's a big problem with that statement, and let's try to unpack that a little bit.
And I wanted to say, again, this is like a graduate level seminar, because y'all are there's so much content, and I wish we had like so much more time to talk about like just this. And we'll have a few more weeks. But I wanted to go back to Pastor Nate's kind of bringing us to that first question around just to re-ask how there's this notion of being the people's university, and we it's a part of the town ethos as well. However, it started off being reserved for the few. So I wanted to ask how people, especially for some of the voices I haven't heard yet, how would you respond to that? You don't necessarily have to try to do it based upon your community of faith, because you can't really, I know you don't necessarily want to speak for them, but I'd love to get at that, and then also keep, I think Will's point about Robert's point about framing and how do we basically address some of these concerns while we think about this kind of dual identity that the university and town both struggle with, about being for the people, or is it really exclusive?
I think
No, go ahead.
Just,
Go ahead, Wes.
just from what you've mentioned, Chris, it seems to me that there were significant periods of time in the university's history where it may have considered itself the people's university, but there was also a parenthetical white in front of the white people's university, not the people's university.
Yeah.
And that's seen by the behaviors of people whose names are enshrined all around the campus, of names like Keenan, that hold prominent places still.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, so, and I've heard this phrase used over and over and over again. And so my comment is much in line with Wes's. I mean, it's, you know, what people are we talking about? And then if this is indeed the people's, if this were going to be the people's university, truly, what would we need to do to, or what would need to be, what doors would be able to be, need to be open, and how would they be open to include more people? So the university to this date struggles in the recruitment of Black students. And so we've heard chancellor after chancellor say it, and, you know, we're just trying to get this figured out, and we're trying to do recruiting. And when I talk to some African-American students on campus, they'd say, gosh, you know, it's really tough being here at this white university. There's something about it that still doesn't feel like it's truly for all people, yet I'll hear administrators say it's not like that other school up the road that is for the privileged few. Yet, you know, in some national studies, people would say that among African-American students, it is one of the safest private universities to be at, because of the African-American Studies program and other kinds of things that culturally make it a slightly more safe space. And so it's just, you know, it's, we say these things as if saying them is going to create a sense of identity and overcome everything else. So, you know, we have doors in front of our church that I hope make a difference. They're rainbow doors. You know, God's doors are open to all. Hope that absolutely makes a difference. And I love hearing people say it's helped me feel more comfortable here in Chapel Hill. But you know what? It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have droves of LGBTQ plus folks walking through our doors. There's something we've got to do to say this is actually, you know, the people's church in that kind of way. You get what I'm saying? We've got a Black Lives Matter door that was knocked down since we put it up, but then we put it up again. It doesn't mean that the next time our doors are open for regathering, all of a sudden we're going to have 10 African-American families hanging out just ready to be here. So you can say it all you want, but you've got to understand what are the structural things and social things that are still in place that are absolutely inhibiting the true living into the rhetoric.
I think that's what I feel as well, that to call it a people's university, what implicit biases do we need to remove beyond just names that are enshrined on the university and places? What other implicit biases need to be removed for it to actually be a place for all people? And even what biases, I mean, within our faith communities, what implicit biases do we need to remove? How do we need to overtly try to rectify that? So I think that's one of the areas I'm sort of at right now.
I think you probably all recognize that white people don't know what they don't know. And for someone to say your problem is whatever they think the problem is without acknowledging the disproportionate number of people of color who are arrested and hassled and incarcerated and denied loans and denied jobs and all of those systemic things. You know, we haven't been taught the history that set up those systems. And so we have work to do. And I think when we hear somebody say something like that, that it's appropriate for us to say, well, did you know? And to talk about maybe a little bit of the history of Chapel Hill, which is close to home for you all, or just some fact that maybe they didn't quite consider when they said your problem is. And from a faith perspective, just to turn it around, like you said, Will, to say, you know, our problem is that as a society, we statistically know that all people are not treated the same. So that's just 2 cents.
It's just as a kind of you know, a comment on during your presentation, you said that the South won the narrative war. And Nate, thinking about, you know, what you were saying about don't act like you know my experience when you're both pastorally working with someone and then also in your experience of people kind of telling you what the problem is. I briefly went on UNC's website to see what the history, you know, on the UNC website, because I'm people in my congregation know that I just don't have I don't do linear time real well, more abstract thinker. So history is always hard for me, and recalling historical facts I'm always relearning. So I was like, Holly, you know, like, where can I find this again so I can re-look at this and kind of go deeper? And from my just quick search of UNC history, the easy thing that would show up in a Google search, there's nothing about this discussion at all, right? So who's writing the narrative, right? Why isn't this on the UNC, the founding of the university, this idea of the People's University and what it didn't include? So anyway, it's just fascinating to me because I thought for sure UNC would have this information. Well, maybe stupidly, I thought for sure. But anyway, at some point, if you could also share with me or with all of us, just going deeper, for those of us that don't hold historical fact real well, that would be helpful for me. Because I'm certainly not going to find it, it seems, on the UNC website easily.
And I'll quickly interject that. In February, early February, just ahead of all of this time period, a new task force on race and history and a way forward was started. And Jim Laludis in history and Pat Parker in communication studies are co-chairing. So even though it's late, there's something, right? But like, I think Jen's point is so important. Like, I think sometimes, and someone mentioned earlier about, you know, getting on the same page, I think it might have been Robert, in an effort to get on the same page, we still have to do something, right? And that's why I, again, applaud y'all doing this, because if we wait, it's never going to happen. And so, to Jen's point, I think the other issue too, and I think this kind of dovetails nicely into the second question that I wanted to because it's all connected, right? To ask you all about, like, and I didn't cite who the quote was from, but so again, Cornelia Phillips Spencer, she basically responded to this small period of Republican leadership of the university and kind of the town, even as a motley collection of ex-Negro teachers and scallywags. So, which, you know, were fighting words in those days. So, but it was redeemed, which of course is another loaded term because we use that language in a lot of faith communities as early as 1871. So, to Jen's point, like, with this short period of time, like, what can we infer about this? The time period when things did try to switch was very short in the longer history, and then how does that play out into the fact that in 2020 we still can't find information about this type of stuff? Partly because, again, you know, the town as well as the university still is reserved for the few. It's highly selective. It's expensive to live here. So how do we kind of unpack stuff we don't know, but also think about it from a current perspective, like the way you all are trying to attack this from your own vantage point? So how do we do both, in you all's opinion?
Chris, I would be interested in learning more about how long the new Republicans were in power and what, why their control of the university or impact over it was so brief. Um, it was interesting for me to hear you talk about Fisk Brewer, because he's someone that I've learned a little bit about historically and sort of identify with in ministry. I understand that he was on the faculty of UNC during that time. And prior to that, he had been a congregational minister who had led a school for freed people in Raleigh. And he was driven out of Chapel Hill because of his advocacy for Black students and for his engagement with Black families in town. And I know about him because after he was sort of driven out of Chapel Hill, he eventually retired in Grinnell, Iowa, which was sort of a haven for abolitionist congregationalists. And that's where I had served in ministry before I came here. So Fisk Brewer had left Chapel Hill and gone to Grinnell and died there. And so before I came to Chapel Hill, I found some information about him in the archives of Grinnell College. And his story is really interesting to me because there were so few Congregationalists, which is sort of my tradition, who were in Chapel Hill in this time. But I also know that their influence was rather brief over the life of the university. And I've always been curious about that.
And I'll quickly respond because I want to make sure I got to Jen's question too, because it's kind of connected. So Brian Stevenson is amazing for lots of reasons. And the fact that he calls it the South winning the narrative war basically speaks to, this idea of, even though militarily the South lost, as some people know, some people are still fighting it, right? So and it was clear that even though the government, presidential Reconstruction happens for a couple of years, right? That doesn't work. So there's a military Reconstruction that begins to try to enforce it. But part of the reason why it was so short is because, as of, I think, because of North Carolina being viewed in this way, and this is something that we should be proud of, in 1867, you got more white crossover. And of course, a lot of them, as you can imagine, were more yeomen. They were more lower class. They weren't the gentry. They weren't the wealthy. But basically, they saw a common tie with the formerly enslaved, and so it was basically, it was the Klan. It was William Saunders and others who began rioting and saying, okay, we gotta put this back the way that it's supposed to be, and that begins a period that basically bookends with the Wilmington insurrection. So although it's just like, you can even think about any kind of Supreme Court case like Brown versus Board, that happened, but we're more resegregated now than we were before. There's lots of decisions, and that's something I wanted to mention too, to the points of how do we arm, how do we have similar language? We need to all say unequivocally that it was public policy that created the problems that we have now. It was not, it wasn't because of moral decay or, that's why y'all were brought over here because, involuntary. I know there are seminaries that teach involuntary migration because, you were pagan and you had to come over to get the word, but what about St. Augustine and all those other people? So there's just so much misinformation and so much stuff that we have to, we're stronger together, it definitely in trying to approach this, but public policy creates, from even the beginning of the country, even to now, is what caused the issues that we have. So I think that's why it was so short, because there wasn't will. President Grant was reached out to. I think I mentioned in the I don't know if I mentioned this in the first one. Actually, I didn't mention this. I'm getting my presentations confused, but Cornelia Phillips Spencer's brother, Jim, he becomes the Solicitor General for Grant. And he works on the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which is great. But there were so few and far between, just like now. If you look at public policy, when things come up, people will issue statements and they will have good faith in publicly, but it's about what you do behind the scenes. So that's kind of to respond to some of the questions, but I want to make sure that we communicate that it's not moral decay. It's not because, Black people or other people of color or marginalized folks are just, something's wrong with them. It's not the fish, it's really the lake that a lot of racial equity work talks about.
I think sometimes it's helpful if we spend more time talking about not racist people, but racist policies, racist statements, racist ideas, uh, if you, I think I've said this before, if you call someone a racist, the conversation basically stops. If you say you're espousing a racist idea, then there's a possibility that the conversation can go on. If we say this was a racist public policy, then in the conversation that follows, people can understand how this dramatically disadvantaged people of color. And in that way, it was racist, rather than they were just a lot of people who were whose intentionality was particularly to hurt Black people or other people of color.
One more thing that I'd say about, why this time period was so shortly lived. And I think you see it over and over again in our history, and illustration that I use local to us is our experience in the school district. And Chris has heard me say this, and several of y'all have heard me say this ad nauseum. But in a cycle of every 7 years, this town figures that, gosh, this achievement and opportunity gap is absolutely morally wrong. I cannot believe that in this enlightened place of Chapel Hill, we have such a large achievement gap between Black and white students. We've got to do something about it. And then we do something about it for, an academic year. I mean, so the will to sustain the work is short-lived. And one of the reasons it's short-lived is because at a certain point, somebody else has a competing interest. At a certain point, somebody really wants something else to be done. And so then they begin to leverage their influence and use their dollars so that some other program can be implemented, and we just forget about this. In fact, we're in one of these phases now where we spend a significant amount of energy talking about the achievement gap across the last school year. Now we have a shift in administration. There's all kinds of possibility for something else to move to the forefront, and then for us to forget about it. I mean, people can tolerate a kind of a racially integrated life for a while. Now, there are folks who said, you know what, I could survive one term in the Obama administration, but two, because it's this idea that, okay, we'll let these folks have their time. But I think you'd said it before, at a certain point, it angered people of wealth who'd invested their fortunes in a different future. And so once you upset folks who are investing their fortunes in a different future, they're going to seek to overturn this kind of integrated life. And I think we see that over and over again, not only in our town, but in other places.
So I think, Justin, to me, that's how the history is helpful, because you can recognize the patterns. And in some sense, that's discouraging because it's like, here we go again. But to talk about the history, it does remove the issues from people currently involved, so that there's sort of an objectivity, and then hopefully you can transfer the pattern then to the issues now. But this period of Reconstruction, I mean, that has to be the heyday of interpersonal racism, and especially the election of 1898 in North Carolina. The public issue was white supremacy, for it or against it. And that was the beginning of Jim Crow in North Carolina. And it has lasted, the repercussions, until right now. And so I do think the history is a very constructive way to surface the issues. But it's very unpleasant history.
Any other thoughts about some of the questions? And then that we were going over from anyone? And so what I'll do too, the last question is something that we can definitely be thinking about, you know, for the remainder of the series, because it's a revelation that I had actually in doing research on this area, and it's about this concept of for one, you know, introducing a term that is definitely very well known in Black and Africana studies of a nadir, or a low point in race relations. Which, you know, some people could, you know, argue maybe that there's a new one, but it really goes from, as Barry was mentioning, you know, Reconstruction to the early 20th century. But it's a very striking contrast with, you know, the last pandemic, 1918 to 1919. And when I was trying to find a year, I was like, okay, was 1919 the Red Summer? I was like, wait a minute, that was the last pandemic. Okay, so what was going on with that? And the fact that, you know, there were 36 cities that, you know, based on, you know, white supremacist terrorism primarily, you know, and responding, because a lot of that had to do with, you know, World War I ending, and, you know, Black GIs coming back and recognizing they were fighting for things that they didn't have at home. And so it's just very interesting how 100 years later, we're and I love that the fact that a young scholar, Robert Greene at Claflin, suggests that we're in a red spring. So just any thoughts about, you know, those parallels in between, you know, back to the idea of, you know, public expressions of hateful actions between those two time periods.
I'll just say that I was just struck by the similarities. I mean, I know that, you know, there in many years past there were you know, philosophical traditions that believe that you know, history repeated itself in cycles of creation and deconstruction and recreation, and so it's fascinating, the convergence between the two, and to think about this red summer and red spring, and, you know, we're talking about in the same time period as you've got the Tulsa massacre. You know, all this stuff is happening, and what makes it bubble up. So on the one hand, what are the aggressors really angry about and trying to crush? And then what helps those who are crushed to rise up, and who comes alongside in moments of solidarity. One of the things that I think about is, my gosh, for so many people, the red spring and red summer, folks are just hearing about them for the first time. And how quickly history can be covered over by likely the people who, were angered, had a lot of wealth, were angry, and wanted a different future.
What comes to mind for me is oh, sorry. The ebb and flow of these issues, and in talking about interpersonal racism, just as a lifelong resident of North Carolina, that has certainly ebbed and flowed in my 57 years. And so there have been periods in which it was very prominent, periods in which there was a high social cost to expressing racist ideas publicly, and then recently, much more open voicing of racist ideas. So a couple of things, just the idea that, okay, we did something important and now we've settled this issue. I need to dispel that notion from my mind. It's such a long struggle for justice and equity. And then, well, yeah, I'd say that's the main thing, just the long standing, effort that's required. Is this discussion impresses that on me.
The coinciding of the confluences 100 years later, a century later, makes it so bald and so plain, and makes it even more teachable and engageable. It's hard to ignore 100 years. It almost makes it biblical. It's another season, and it really helps us to reflect and to be humble and to be empowered. I think it can't be ignored that way.
I think the tie-in with the 100 years of women garnering the vote, and to remember that women weren't given the vote, they fought for the vote, but even then, women of color were not given the vote, and it took many decades later for them to have access to the voting booth. So all of these tie-ins, I think, are appropriate.
And again, I'm very thankful to the group for such a robust and lively conversation. I've learned a lot, and I wanted to mention that for next week we'll move on to the World War I period through pre-Brown versus Board. So we'll be doing till about 1950. So it will have another term to consider. So, all right, well, thank you all, and I'll turn it back over to Justin.
Well, again, it's been great being with everyone. I've been blessed by this conversation, even though we're talking about some hard things. And so, Chris, thank you very much, and to all of my peers here, thank you as well. We look forward to seeing everyone again next week.